Recording in progress. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to School of Speech, presented by SpeechTherapyPD. I'm your host, Carolyn Dolby, and I am so excited for today's conversation. All right. School of Speech is the podcast where we come together as school-based SLPs to learn from each other, to explore into important topics, and really keep growing in the work that we do every single day. Well, today's episode is actually part 2 of our conversation on demystifying developmental language disorder. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I highly recommend going back and giving that a listen, because in that episode, we really built the foundation on what is DLD, how it fits into our school systems, and how we think about it as our role as an SLP. Because today we are taking it even further, and we are talking about what DLD actually looks like over time. How assessment and intervention and our decision making really evolve as our students grow and academic demands increase. And I am so excited to welcome back our returning guests, Wendy Morgan and Diane Ogiela, both from Idaho State University. All right, Wendy is an associate clinical professor and clinical coordinator with over 15 years of clinical experience working primarily with preschool and school-age children. She also teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in clinical practice and professional issues. And Diane is an associate professor and director of the Child Language Lab and graduate program director at Idaho. I don't know why I'm having trouble with Idaho. My niece lives there. State University. Her work focuses on language development, assessment practices, and supporting students with developmental language disorder and dyslexia, with particular expertise in morphology, syntax, and narrative skills. Wendy and Diane, welcome back. Yay!
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited for part 2. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to just do our little housekeeping I always do. Each episode of School of Speech is offered for 0.1 ASHA CEUs through your SpeechTherapyPD account. And if you are listening live, be sure to complete all the course modules, including the one that says complete course at the end of today to make sure you receive credit. Just a quick little heads up, because every now and then, okay, every single time, my conversations tend to go a little over our 60-minute mark. And if you're joining us live and you need to jump off right at the hour, no worries. You can jump off and head right to Speech Therapy PD account and complete your course, and you will receive full credit. But of course, we want you to stay if you can. So please stay if you can. Also, if you're listening live, we want to be interactive with you. So we want all your questions and comments and everything in the chat. And I always like to start, hey guys, jump in the chat, say hi, let me know where you're at. I already looked at some of our listeners, and I see a lot of familiar names. So hi, thanks for coming back, but I still want everyone to jump in the chat. While you're doing that, I'm going to do the disclosures. My disclosures: I am a salaried employee of Portland Public Schools in Portland, Oregon. Hi, Jennifer. And I receive compensation from Speech Therapy PD for hosting this podcast. Wendy receives a salary as an employee of Idaho State University. She's also a member of Idaho Speech, Language, and Hearing Association and ASHA, and serves as a clinic coordinator. Oh, look at everybody. I love it. Diane receives a salary as well from Idaho State University, and occasionally does receive honorarium for lectures and workshops. She's a member of both Idaho Speech Language Hearing Association and ASHA, and serves as the SLP program director. Okay, guys. All right. Like I said in the beginning, part 1, the last episode, we laid the groundwork for understanding what DLD. Oh, hi everybody! Oh, look at that! Yay! Hi everyone! I'm so glad you guys are all here. Okay, so with the groundwork that you laid, I think one of the biggest shifts for clinicians is recognizing that this disorder, this DLD doesn't look the same at every single age. So let's start here. Like, we know that, so yes, we know that, maybe we don't know. Maybe you know what? Maybe we don't know that it doesn't present the same way across development. I don't know. I don't know what I don't know. So why don't we start with what I probably don't know, and walk through how the profile of DLD changes from preschool to adolescence. I mean, that's a huge, I mean, just in everything is different, true, but let's go with just the profile, how it changes, maybe some red flags that might look different later on than what they might in the beginning. Who wants to start with that?
Okay, well, I can dive in. I do want to share, if I may, for a moment,
Oh, of
just
course.
I wanted to share this link. We talked last time about the importance of using the term developmental language
Mhm.
disorder, and that it doesn't contradict anything in idea or in school practices. And Wendy brought up the letter that Asha wrote to this to the Department of Education on that. So I thought I'd put that link there so that I could share it with you. And well, actually, Wendy found it. And we put the link here so that you can use that and share that with your schools, with your special ed directors if need be, just so that you have that um, there for yourself.
Thank you
Okay,
so much. I love it.
I can
sure,
even
sure.
just say, DLD, this is a letter from ASHA 2023. And DLD is when a child or adult has difficulties taking or understanding language. The hallmarks are difficulty learning new words, remembering them, and grammar learning and use. And a big part of the discussion in the last one is a child with DLD is sometimes identified for services as a specific learning disability under federal law because characteristics of DLD contribute to SLD. So, in part, the specific learning disability is defined by IDEA as a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in the use, I'm going to say this, involved in the understanding or in use of language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself. So just be thinking about the ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disability, brain. Anyway, so that's those key pieces that we'll be talking about today.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you to Suzanne, one of our listeners. This is a personal episode for her. So I just want to give you a little shout out. Suzanne, thanks for joining us from Seattle. All right, here we go. Sorry. Okay, back to business. Here we go.
All right.
All right. Thank you again for sharing that link. I think it's really important that we start using the words and in a meaningful way and have that data and research behind why we are really wanting to make sure that we are making accurate diagnoses and treating it as such. Okay, sorry, here we go.
All right, so if we dive in, a lot of times kids are identified as having language problems fairly early. We see early developmental milestones not being met. And as kids get older, those milestones are less and less concrete. They're pretty concrete early on, right? We expect our first words by 12 months, we expect 50 words by 18 months, etc. Combinations at 2.5 years, 200, 250 words. And kids follow that pretty well in typical development. But then once we get past the preschool age, things get really fuzzy because we don't have those really concrete milestones anymore. And what we have is this further development of language, and it's a refinement of language. Most of the big things in language are in typical kids are set by about age 6.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that we don't typically diagnose DLD in a child under the age of 3. It would be very difficult to do that. There are so many things that could be happening. Sure, it's an option, it's a possibility, but we need to see, are they late talkers? Do they have autism? Do they have an intellectual disability? There's lots of things that we can have there. By the time they're 3 to 5, in that preschool age, we're going to notice typically that they may have a lower vocabulary. They're not saying as much. They're not combining as much. And where other kids here are really starting to use grammatical morphemes, we see that these kids may not be using those grammatical morphemes, especially the ones associated with verbs and with verb tense. And so that's going to be a piece. They're also not going to use language in all the same functions that typical kids do. They might be slower in doing that. They might still be focused on what do I need, what do I want, and they might not be seeking information yet, and those types of things. But one of the things we see SLPs often say is that, well, the child has a language delay. And what we don't want to be saying is that a 7-year-old has a language delay, because a 7-year-old with a language delay has a language disorder. Because delay implies the catching up. And if they were a late talker, they would have caught up by, at least by the end of kindergarten. They would seem that they're in that typical range. They still need to be watched, because we do know that kids who are late talkers may still have subtle difficulties later on. They're still at higher risk for dyslexia as well. We want to keep that in mind. But really, by the time they're in kindergarten, we need to kind of not be talking about delays, because some studies have shown that parents get frustrated with that. They thought their child was delayed and it wasn't that serious, so we're just going to wait for them to catch up, and it doesn't happen. And now they're in 3rd grade and they can't read and they're struggling in school and things like that. So that goes to, again, kind of why we need to be using the term and that. And so once we get through preschool, most kids have met those basic language milestones, and we're in kindergarten now. And so our kindergartners, 1st, 2nd, 3rd graders will seem younger in terms of their language use. Most kids at 6 are using grammatical morphology within their dialect, within the context of their own dialect, at the same rate that adults do. And so if they're not, that should be an area of concern. They're still maybe struggling with some everyday vocabulary. They may have the immediate basics, but they don't have a wide range once we go outside of the everyday talk. And so in school, as new concepts are being presented, we might see some red flags with the vocabulary, lots of indefinites, this, that, stuff, it, those types of things.
Yeah.
Like.
Right? So that's what we're seeing, and we'll see more grammatical errors in kids in K through 3. We'll see more than we see in older kids, because they're still making those types of errors. Anything else that people see as red flags kind of in those preschool years? I'm sorry, the kindergarten to the 3rd grade?
Yeah, throw that in the chat. What kind of red flags that you might see K through 3? Just to get you thinking.
Yeah, if you're listening live and you work with the primary grades, the early elementary and elementary, give us some ideas of what you're seeing.
And I have a couple that I haven't mentioned yet, so.
Yeah.
Or re-mention them, it's good. Quiet today.
Well, I think that the ones that I mentioned are the biggies.
Oh, here they're coming. Now they're coming in.
Oh, here we go.
Right, here's one. Oh, thanks, Suzanne. She's saying he's looking at me like he's listening, but he has no recall of what that she's saying. Like, right, they're looking like they present like they're understanding, but then there's no follow through. Like, you really didn't understand what I was saying. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm right up there with you.
And I love that I see the social there, because the social is often coming out not just in the not being friendly or anything like that, but oftentimes it might come out in, well, the other kids have already recognized that this child's not at their level and they're also not participating. And when they are starting to use figurative language, this child is having difficulty with figurative language. And so oftentimes, it's not always true, but oftentimes they don't become kind of in that social group. And they have a harder time kind of navigating the nuances of social language as well. So that's definitely there.
I would say
Classroom
definitely.
management.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
I was just thinking, like just even with humor. I remember when my daughter was, her name's True, when she was about 3.5, 4, she was still maybe 4. She was young and we were on this long walk and she was kind of running ahead with my sister and she turned around, she goes, "Hey guys, catch up." And then she goes, "Ha ha, catch up." And she made like her first joke at 4. And I could see how that might go over the head of, so, like not understanding those nuances of language, the semantic humor, if you will.
Absolutely. And actually there's semantic humor. That's actually semantics as well as phonological humor, right?
Mhm.
So if a child has phonological difficulties, they're also not making those connections. I also like that we see here the classroom management. These kids will often watch other kids in order to engage with the classroom management and what they're supposed to do next, as opposed to being able to follow more complex directions. The other thing that I left off has to do with syntax. So we often think of the errors, and many of the errors that we see are those grammatical errors. But besides grammatical errors, we have question formation errors where the child says, "What this is," instead of "What is this?" They didn't invert the copula and the subject like you're supposed to when you create a question. They may have that type of grammatical difficulty. The other thing we really need to be looking at in this age range is not just what the kids do, it's what do they not do. They're still speaking in, and it might be grammatical. They might not even be making errors per se, subject, verb, object, but kids this age are also going subject, verb, prepositional phrase, subject, verb, object, prepositional phrase, subject, verb, infinitive clause, subject, verb, participle clause, subject, verb, relative clause, subject, verb, noun, relative clause, all these things that typical kids are now producing, and they aren't, and they don't always show up as errors, but they're not absent. They're probably not absent, but they're probably not there in the same at the same level that it is for typical kids. So this is what we're seeing in that age that sometimes once they start using those grammatical morphemes and they're using them pretty frequently, we can be like, "Oh, they're all better now." I mean, I've myself have dismissed more than one kid because they met their goals and they, scored a 79, but we need to be looking at, well, can they do other things with that? So that moves us to the next age range, right? The 4th to 6th graders. And for the 4th to 6th graders, where we're going to see their vocabulary difficulty is going to be in those content areas in school. They're going to be struggling in science and social studies and health class, learning those more complex words, higher level vocabulary, subject specific vocabulary. Their syntax may also seem less mature, not as well developed as typical kids. And again, we have to look at not what they're doing, but also what do we expect them to do that they're not doing. After about age 6 or 7, about 20% of kids' language production should be complex sentences. So we have to be careful with that too, because I've seen students write goals for like, we'll produce complex sentences 50% of the time. And it's like, oh, even adults don't do that. So we have to be careful about that. But we'll see it in the narrative. Somebody mentioned here the narrative, that they're not explaining the narrative in a coherent way. That's a combination of macrostructure of narrative, microstructure of the vocabulary. How do I use this new vocabulary? Am I using it correctly? How do I put that into syntax? And then how do I keep track of my characters in a story? So we're going to see that. And starting, at least in Idaho schools, in 4th grade is when they start writing narratives. So not only are we talking about spoken narratives, but now we're talking about reading and writing. And so that becomes another challenge as well. And their comprehension will tend to be more literal. They might be okay with the details of the story, but how was the character feeling? What was he planning to do? What was he worried about? Those types of things are going to be more difficult for them to access because it depends on the actual language and the words of the language, world knowledge, knowledge of a story structure, and pulling all those things together. So that's where where we may see kids and feel like, oh, I had a conversation with them and they did okay. But if that conversation is about the soccer game on Saturday, then something they did with their friends, they went to a movie, we might miss the fact that when it comes to academic types of language, they're really struggling. And what their academics and success in school depends on isn't just the conversational level, but that academic level of language. And so we want to be looking at those pieces as well, and at that academic language. So so with those kids, one of the things about vocabulary we need to keep in mind too is that if a child in 4th grade is supposed to have about 6,000 productive words, if we're just having a conversation with them about what they did over the weekend, or what they did over summer break, how would we know the difference between a kid with 4,000 words and a kid with 6,000 words? Like I couldn't tell the difference unless we went to academic stuff and evaluated academic stuff. Especially for those kids who don't have as severe of impairments, because they may have gotten their grammatical morphemes. But when we look at some of the studies, it shows that when kids have to then go read and write, all those errors and difficulties they had in spoken language that now seem to be gone, they show back up in written language, because written language is harder. You have to manage the pencil or the keyboard. You have to manage the spelling. You have to manage capital letters and periods and commas. And that's a lot to handle. So those things that aren't automatic in their language kind of fall away. Not that they're making the same levels of errors that they did at 6, but they're still making those errors at higher rates than their typical peers.
I really liked when in the mind shift that you've made twice, and I love it so much, is when you said we can't just look at what they are doing and how they're doing it, but what they should be doing and are not doing. That's super meaningful for me. That hit, I went, okay, that I am starting to get, because it's true. Like a lot of times when we're assessing, we're just going, oh, yep, they did that. Oh, yep, I see that. Oh, yep, there's that. But really understanding developmental stages and what they should be doing that is absent from what they are doing. I think that's just really powerful.
But as a clinician, and actually even just as any person, it is harder to look for something that might not be there, because when do you know that you stop looking, right?
Well, that's true. I mean, we only have so many hours in a week to evaluate.
So it's really challenging. So let me give you a hint, is look at the child's work product. Okay. Because you can look at work product faster than you can give yet another assessment. So if they have written work that they've turned in, and you can get that written work, you can kind of compare that to what you expect for that age. And you can see oh, this is what's missing. This is what's not here. A book report, an essay, a story. And you don't have that much work product for kindergarten through 3rd grade. That's really kind of self-generated, but we do in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade.
Sure.
And that's a great place to go, because it doesn't cost you a whole lot of additional time of eliciting. The teacher should already have it.
I love that. Okay, so you just gave us also a little quick freebie when we're doing our assessment, is if we're going to be asking for those work samples, work products, especially when we're going to the older grades, because those can be very lengthy evaluations, utilizing what they're already producing in the classroom. And that also directly ties and aligns to the fact that we're here for academics, and we want to see how their language is impacting their academic work. And boom, that just brought it right, gives us right there. There's a reason. I love that.
Can I ask the listeners if they can just give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down if they've utilized some of the academics and looked at that with the classroom teacher? Or maybe they will.
Oh, there we go. No, they are. They're like, yeah, there they go. There they go.
Good.
We have a little lag in the, yeah. Oh, lots of them. Okay, so everybody's doing this. Okay, I love it.
Okay, so it wasn't new.
Well,
No.
I liked it. I like
It
it.
still, it validates that you're doing the right
yeah.
thing.
You know what? Let's go with that. That this is absolutely validating that everybody here is doing the right thing and making sure that we are looking at how they're accessing the academics and how they're working there. Okay, sorry.
And it helps to be efficient too, because that's one of the biggest things. Like I always felt initially, especially that I had to go find everything and generate everything. And there's just not enough time to do things as thoroughly as we may want to. But if there are things that already exist, whether it's testing that our psychologist has done, or it's things from the classroom, that just saves us so much time and energy.
But that's a great, when we're talking about assessment, like making sure that we are adding these things. Is there any other impacts we need to think about when we're looking at making sure that we are doing a good assessment?
Well, as we get to the older stage of the kind of 4th through 6th grade and even going up in age, one of the things that we want to include in assessment is not just the concrete language stuff. Can you do this? Can you not do this? Because, and we'll talk a little bit later about kind of shifting how we shift our therapy, that we want to be developing greater independence in our kids, because we want them to be independent and adults who can, hold jobs, continue to go to school, go to college, do those things. That we want to take a look and within this assessment, especially at the older range of the 4th through 6th grade and 7th and 8th graders, what kind of strategies are they using? Not just hacks, but strategies for learning and strategies for learning language, knowing that it's more challenging. So one of the things that that I emphasize a lot is being upfront with the kids. I don't know why, at least when I was a younger SLP, I would kind of dance around the not wanting to tell kids they did things wrong and oh, we're here to play some games and well, we're really here to work on your speech and on your language. And this is why it's going to help you. We're working on your vocabulary, so it's easier for you to learn new words. I'm going to teach you some tricks. We're going to do things. And so within our assessment, we want to see what kind of strategies can the child use, because if they can't, then that becomes part of our therapy. So that part of our goals is to teach them to use various strategies, whether it's inferencing inferencing the meanings of new words from the context, from the contextual cues, from what you know about a topic, or using a dictionary. And so I would want that to be part of my assessment. Those things don't take a whole lot of time. You can kind of just have them look something up and see what they give you, and then kind of probe, what other information do you have there? And you can see for many of the kids, it stops after this word means blank, but a dictionary entry has so much more information there that they can use to learn that will help them be a high schooler and be a college student, or just be an adult. So that's one of the pieces of assessment that I would look at. And I would also really want to look at the pragmatics of academic discourse. Can they do the things that they need to be able to do academically? Write a book report, pick out somebody has said before, I saw here, picking out the main idea, 3 supporting details that tell you that that's the main idea. Those types of tasks that are very discourse related, because that's making it curriculum based. And including that in the assessment is really important.
What I'm hearing is sort of like what they're asked to do in math, show your work. Tell me your thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did you, especially if you're going to be reading we'll stay with that same example of an unknown word. in a sentence or whatever, and they say, well, that word means, blank, and then say, well, prove it. Kind of a thing. Like, how do you know that means that? What in here is yeah. I mean, all of that inferencing, obviously, but I just kind of like in math, you show your work. In speech, we show our words.
And that's exactly what we want to be able to do in therapy, so that they can actually learn to do those strategies, so that they can use those strategies, because they're not going to be in therapy forever. We don't want them to be in therapy forever. We want them to be in therapy as long as they need to get the skills to be able to navigate, as independently as possible. And the other thing that I would say about assessment that's really important is that we match the assessment to the child's needs. One of the things that really strikes me when I've been doing studies, and I found that certain tests were not tapping the skills that kids seem to have difficulties with, and other tests were tapping different skills, is that we want to match if we're using norm reference tests, we want to make sure that they're matching the skills that the child is having difficulties with, not the test we've given them 3 times before.
Tell me more about that. Say more words.
So for example, I am a fan of the TILS. That's the Test of Integrated Language and Literacy. I really am. I really like this test because it looks at things that are academic. It looks at the building blocks of literacy. It looks at semantics. It looks at the pragmatics of being able to tell a story and retell a story. These are all important things. One of the things that I noticed, though, is that I have this child who actually did okay on the TILS, but he's talking to me and he's not using the past tense, and he's not using the third person singular, and he's using hardly any combined sentences. He's not using coordinating or subordinating conjunctions. He's saying, he needed an umbrella. It's raining out, instead of he needed an umbrella because it's raining out, which creates a complex sentence. Well, the TILS doesn't formally tap. There's no measure of morphology or syntax. If I go to the SELF-5, another test that I use, and I think is psychometrically a good test, and many of us, I would say most of us, have probably used the SELF-5. It does tap those skills, but if you only stick with the core, the core subtests, the 4 or 5 that you need to give to get that core score, you're actually not looking at the child's language in any kind of context, right? So on that test, I'm like, I almost always give the understanding spoken paragraphs, because that tells me, can the child understand a set of sentences that are cohesive? Can they pull out the main idea? Can they make an inference? And those types of things. And sometimes that's not enough, because reading is harder. So I might use some of the SELF and some of the TILS to kind of tap the skills that the child does have difficulty with. And if the child's doing well in vocabulary, then that's probably not something I want to spend a whole lot of time on. I'll go to those things that they are having more challenges with at a discourse level or at a complex syntax level or something along those lines. And something, for example, a 1-word vocabulary test just doesn't tell us that much. It just doesn't. It's a subset of words. It's very culturally biased in that. But if you look at the vocabulary tests on both the SELF and the TILS, where they have to make connections between words, like how are these related? Oh, that gives us more information. So, but I keep talking. I'm sorry.
No, I love this.
I get carried away.
I think you're hitting home the point that we can't rely too heavily on a standardized test. Not every test is going to be suited for your child, because they might not test what we're looking for. So I'm assuming I mean, most of us all are required to have one standardized test at least, right? But we can't, unfortunately, we can't stop there. And it's so interesting that you brought up the self-core, because my speech lead and I were just talking about that, how, when you're looking at a speech evaluation coming in from maybe another district or somewhere else, and you realize all they've done was the core, and thinking like, what could have been missed,
Well, and if that was supplemented with other types of assessment, that's fine if you have the core. But one of the things that bothers me about the core is, and I've had people tell me, oh, you have to use the core score. There is nothing in any state standards that I've read that says you have to use the core or composite score. If the, like in Idaho, it's a deficit in receptive and or expressive language. So if sometimes we'll see these kids that have these really low scores on expressive, but then they do really well with following directions, or not really well, they even just do average, and suddenly their core is in the average range.
Mm-hmm.
But you can look at just the receptive language index or the expressive language index or the structural language index or the content language index. And often kids with DLD, some will have relative strengths in vocabulary, some will have relative strengths in grammar and weaknesses in vocabulary. And by looking at those tests more critically, and it can be really helpful and can tell us what we need to probe more.
I like that. Thank you. We do have a question, if that's okay, from Susan. Do you have any recommendations for ELL students, assessments that you might recommend?
That's a tough question because
Okay.
ELL is a big group.
Mm.
So is it ELL of a child who has been in the States for 6 months, or is it ELL for a child who's been in the country for 4 years?
Fair.
The research has shown that for kids to learn the cognitive and academic language, it takes 5 to 7 years. We often have this expectation that once they can have a conversation, they're good to go. We can kind of expect them to operate, like with all the other kids, but it's really challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other thing is if the child's a Spanish speaker, there are tests that are norm reference tests that we can use with Spanish speakers that will let us look at both languages and things like that. For other kids, that's not necessarily the case. And so one of the things that's really helpful for ELL, I would say probably one of the two tools, I'll say the two most important things is, one is the question to the parents, if possible. Sometimes I know it's hard in schools to kind of connect with parents face to face, and if they don't have the English proficiency and you don't speak their language, that can also be a challenge. But it's, how does your child compare to other children who speak your language? That's the big tell-all, because if they have a difficulty with a language, it will show up in both languages in different ways, but in both languages. The other thing is dynamic assessment. And by dynamic assessment, I'm specifically referring to the type of dynamic assessment that's most important is the test, teach, retest method, that for those different areas in the different domains of language, to test them. How do they do on on the morphemes? How do they do on syntax? How might they do on like vocabulary? Do they know these vocabulary words? Can they pick them out? Can they use them in a sentence? And that's your kind of your baseline, your pretest data. And then you try to teach each of those things. So teach them the past tense, teach using is and not just using the progressive verb. Like he is swimming, she is swimming. And I would stick with one type. I wouldn't use is, are, was all at once, right? But just to see how do they do with that? So you're teaching that to them, teach it, go through it once or twice, and then come back later. And how well did they hold on to the new vocabulary words you taught, the morphemes that you taught? the sentence structure, the sentence structure, yes, no sentence structure that you taught.
Oh, you just went into witness protection. We were joking about that earlier. So you guys that are watching, sorry, she'll be back in just a minute, but we can still hear you.
And if you can't, let me know.
Oh, no, there you are.
I'm back.
Well, and what she's saying with that teach, test, retest is kids aren't going to remember those things because they have problems with vocabulary and learning new things. They're not going to hold on to it. So you don't need a standardized assessment necessarily.
Yeah, it can be really supportive of saying this child is ELL, yes, but this child also has a language impairment, DLD, and needs to work on language and needs those strategies, because that children with DLD need more exposure and more elaborated exposure than typically developing kids. And so if the child comes back and they're at 85%, well, they're probably doing all right, you know? But if they come back and they're at 30% or 50%, they really should have held on to that knowledge that you taught them. I mean, it depends on how much time you've spent and how much you've gone into depth on that. But that's really telling, because that tells you there's a language learning difficulty, not just there's a problem with learning vocabulary in English. And the other thing we want to be very aware of is that the older kids get, the harder it is, especially for grammar, the harder it is for them to learn the grammar of the second language. And so we have to be even more careful as kids get older. They may not be DLD, but they may still have a difficulty, getting that past tense or that inversion of the auxiliary verb and the subject type of thing. So for example, so my family, my first language was not English. And so my sisters, one was 10 when they came to the US and one was 11. And as adults, when you talk to the one who was 11, oh, she has an accent, and a couple of little grammatical things. But the one who was 10, you would never know that she was not a native English speaker. And so we have to be careful of that, especially as the ELL kids get older. Did that help at all?
Oh, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense, but we also have to, and I like when you're following that up with, we also have to determine the difference between, we also have to make sure that there's a language disorder, language learning difficulty in both languages.
Yes. Yeah. And that's really important. And someone here mentioned the EOW PVT and the ROW PVT. Both of those are single word vocabulary tests. Here's the picture, tell me what it is, pick one out of the four. And they don't cover regional Spanish or the various dialects of Spanish, and they're very specific to those particular words. But what we really want to look at is, what are the connections between words? So another thing that you can try teaching is, can you learn happy and glad and cheerful, that these are related words, versus just a specific word? Because the vocabulary, when we learn vocabulary, we're not just learning word definition. We're really learning word through multiple exposures. We figure out what it means. Definition comes later because that's metalinguistic. What is it connected to? Can it be used as both a noun and a verb? Can it also be used as an adjective? We learn so much about words. And so a single word vocabulary test, like those two that were mentioned, they don't give us that. They give us like a benchmark compared to other kids. But again, I know that my husband speaks Spanish and he learned Northern Mexican Spanish, and my sister-in-law, his sister, she's lived in Chile, and their Spanish is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That for real.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. I think we're getting the understanding that our assessment needs to be robust. We really need to look at how they're learning language and knowing what the strategies they're using or what strategies they're not using. So, okay, I think maybe could we now, I mean, we could go on about assessment, and I think we could do a whole nother webinar on that, and I might be hitting you up on that one for sure. But I guess then for today, I want us to also talk about the next big question, which is intervention. And what should we be doing differently in therapy as our expectations are shifting? Maybe, you know, we want them to be independent. We want to increase their academic performance. How does our therapy stay relevant for what the students are facing in the classroom?
Wendy, do you want to talk a little bit about that K through third and the kind of those basic
Yes.
still language skills?
Yeah, I love the K through third population, and you still need to focus on the content of language while they're learning to read, and so you're including all that pre-literacy skills, and you're looking at the bigger structure and trying to be pretty deliberate about how you're organizing your treatment sessions. Narrative, use of narratives is huge. I'd love to know if your if folks in the listening are using some narrative learning, which includes that macro structure. And so I have used the story champs mostly in the skills, and that macro structure is looking at the character, the setting, the problem feeling, the plan, the actions, the end feelings, and just you really trying to use a variety of stories to build whatever area that you're focusing on. If it's the syntax, if it's vocabulary, if you're looking at increasing organizational skills with those cohesive ties, and at that K through 3, you want them to be able to tell a story that is more complex than just said, yes, I went to school today. Yes, I had lunch, or no, I didn't have lunch, or I ran down the playground. You want them to be able to explain something that's more complex. And I think story champs, skills narrative, the mind wing story grammar marker is all things that can be used really well at that K through 3rd grade. So I didn't look to see if anybody responded, but
I love it. And just when I think about the power of personal narratives, I always jump back. I had Carol Westby on. If you guys haven't, oh my gosh, she is my spirit.
Amazing.
And I mean, first of all, I couldn't imagine, I was so pleased that she was like, of course, Carolyn. I was like, oh, anyway, so I have an episode on with Carol Westby. If you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it. And it's all on the power of personal narratives and how important it is for us to be able to tell our personal narrative, how powerful it is and how it just sort of integrates across. I mean, it just spreads. Oh, it was just a goose skin pimple.
But it really helps to have that structure, that organizational structure, and it has to be repetitive using multiple stories to then be able to tell their own story so that they have that
you have to reminisce.
structure.
You have to, but I know story champs, so I'll reference that one because I am familiar with that. In showing them how to structure the story, practicing that, and then being able to then utilize that for themselves too. Yeah.
And the thing about using narratives with K through 3rd, and I'm more likely to use more narrative with the 2nd and 3rd graders, because sometimes for kids with DLD, the kindergarten and 1st graders, they're still working on just sequencing events sometimes. And so we have to be at a little bit lower level. It really depends on the child's level. But I like to think of therapy as not just doing like one thing or one set of things. You know, that, oh, well, we're doing morphemes, so we're going to do morphemes for an entire year. We're doing vocabulary, so we're going to do vocabulary for an entire year. All of those things are important. And past preschool, most kids will benefit from structure. Some preschoolers really can't handle the highly structured stuff. But the older kids they can do structured things, and that helps build some automaticity. So sure, work on some sentences and those types of things, but then we can't stop there. We can, in the same session, we can practice our past tense, and then we can work on our story. And then I'm going to say, oh, he jumped over the puddle. He jumped. Oh, I used my t at the end there, didn't I? And when the kids are producing it, say, oh, did he jump? Did you want to say jump or jumped? And then, and so you're building it into the story. And there was a boy. Well, tell me something about the boy. He has a red shirt. Oh, the boy who was wearing the red shirt jumped over the puddle. And I just got a complex sentence modeled, right? So by doing this and not just completely compartmentalizing, I'm doing a morphology goal, I'm doing a syntax goal, I'm doing a vocabulary goal. Working with narrative allows us to do explicit teaching in those little areas to build the skill and the ability. And then we move to the narrative. And now we're taking that explicit teaching that we did and we're applying it to a context. And it's going to impact implicit learning and generalization. And we're not waiting till the end of the year to start doing generalization of anything, right? We're building it in and moving through. And so that it's all part of the language use, and it's not a half hour of kind of a flashcards. Now, I too will use flashcards when I need to. I'm not saying I won't, but what I've learned over time, and it takes time and practice to kind of develop that skill, that we need to be moving quicker into generalization, and that sometimes helps their accuracy in things even at that very structured level, because they've now made the connection. So with those kids, that's one of the things that I'm going to focus on. But during this K-3 time, it's also the learning to read time. And we know that we have a lot of overlap between DLD and dyslexia. And so here, I'm also going to make sure that I'm infusing, or if they have explicit goals for phonemic awareness and those types of reading skills that they may or may not be getting in the general classroom, and that our language kids need more focus on. So I'm also going to be pulling in the language and pulling in the reading and writing, especially once we get to second and third grade as well. I see a couple questions here.
That most of these narrative languages, I'm looking at Megan's question, high-tech AAC for this population, you can use any of these narrative learning tasks with children that have AAC. Again, I know Story Champs has done some research with the AAC users. It might be helpful.
Yeah, and there's another question here about using, or maybe it's the same question, high-tech AAC for this population. I would be less likely to use AAC per se for kids with DLD, because typically kids with DLD are going to be spoken language users. They're going to be spoken language users, even if they have a severe language impairment, like they have scores, of 60 on the self. They're probably still primarily spoken language users. But there are a lot of tools that some would consider to be AAC and some people might not consider it to be AAC, that can be used to help support their language, not as what they're going to use to produce language, but that they could use these to help them with the written language, to help them with the comprehension and those types of things. For example, readers, something that reads aloud for you if you're having a lot of difficulty making out the words, but you can take that in auditorily. That's going to help you with your science, even if you couldn't read it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't learn to read it. It means we need to move forward in science while we're still working on reading. And I'm not sure if that really tapped that question, because I haven't used AAC at a like at a microstructure level with grammar with kids. So I'd have to really think about that question.
Something to think about and something to come back on. Thank you, Megan, for getting us thinking. Yeah, I like it. Keeping us on looking at, I'm just looking at the time. We were talking about K2, K3. What about changing thoughts that we need to think about interventions with our older kiddos?
Well, I think with the older kiddos, we still want to be teaching language, but we have to be really teaching them and spending more time on teaching them strategies for learning language and for using language. And I think here we do have some high-tech tools that can really help kids with writing in particular. But they really need to be learning how to do things. Even something like using something like a graphic organizer. If people aren't, I think most people are probably familiar with graphic organizers, but if not, it's one thing to use that to teach a topic, but if you can teach the kid to use a graphic organizer to organize their thoughts, then they can use that as the template for their to write an essay. If you can teach them to outline, if you can teach them to use a better dictionary than dictionary.com. I personally like Merriam-Webster a little bit better, but teaching them to go past the definition down to where it shows multiple definitions and identifying which definition fits the context that you're looking this word up for. Because if you go and look up orbit as a noun, initially you're going to get the eyeball. And then you're going to get it as a verb to go around. But then what do you call the trajectory of the Earth around the sun? It's the orbit, right? And the moon orbits, has an orbit. It's a noun.
I just had a light bulb off. Thank you so much for that. Oh my gosh, Diane. Thank you. So I love when I have like little aha moments, like, oh my God.
So for these older kids, really teaching them to do these things and be able to use the tools that are out there. And we have a lot more technological tools that can be really effective, as long as we don't try to teach that to replace learning the skill. Right. I think AI is another conversation for another day, but
it is. But right, using the strategies that you have on hand. I like that. Like, what can we use that we would use in everyday life? But that doesn't mean that we can't also, we have to use other strategies. So you're not going to be able to have a dictionary in the middle of a test. So that is one strategy, but you also have to teach other strategies, context clues and such.
And you can also advocate for that child when they move
to be able to use a dictionary, right?
When they move to a 504 plan, if they move out of therapy, that they can use a dictionary. And I see here, I think it's Suzanne saying, how do I feel about Greek and Latin roots? I think it's important to learn morphological breakdown of words and those key pieces. Whether or not a child can learn the spelling pattern for Latin versus Greek really depends on the child, right? Because that impacts the spelling patterns. However, if we can teach the kid that port means carry, then transportation means something. The port that the ships come into are carrying products from other countries. I can have a computer that's on the desk, or I can have one that's portable. It's able to be carried. I think that teaching those pieces can bloom a vocabulary, and teaching them to look for the connections in meaning with words that they know can really be, especially for high school kids or in a kid DLD going to college, that can really open up the ability to learn more words without having to learn each thing as if it's an individual word.
Absolutely. Down to like just teaching like fun, just for quickness would be right? Not doing like, how many words can you now have in your vocabulary, just adding to a word and having fun with that. It just brings me back when I was a kindergarten teacher. I used to be like, I'm having unfun right now. And I joked about it that, okay, we don't really say unfun, but anyway, yeah.
Okay, I'm funful right now,
You're
Carolyn. I'm
funful.
funful.
You are funful, and I'm having a funfulness time. Even though you just went dark. No,
Sorry about that.
it's all right. I know you'll be coming back to us in a minute. Wow. Okay. So we have talked about how DLD changes over time, how it presents differently from preschool through adolescence, and how I think an important takeaway that I have is that we shouldn't be saying language delay because we're setting up our families for disappointment. And I think that's a strong lesson to hear. Strong because I think sometimes we do candy coat things because we want to be careful and I think we should be kind when we are presenting our information, but I think we should be truthful that and when we have the data that states that by kindergarten, this is what your student should be doing. And that goes to the next point that was really impactful for me is that mind shift of not just what are they doing, but what should they be doing that they're not doing. And that would be, so not using the word delay, then that mind shift of saying, this is what students, kids this age should be doing that your student is not doing. And this is, and the reason why, blah, 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 would be a really kind way to, yeah.
And I would follow that up with, though, that we do want parents to, and kids, especially, and I think we need to be upfront with our kids too, but why they're coming to see us, what we're doing, but to say, so this is what we can work on, and this is what we can do. We can learn better ways to remember words. We can learn better ways to put chunks of words together so that you can write that essay, so that you can do this better. We can learn to use a graphic organizer to help you independently be able to do these things. Because that's where we can be positive, because these aren't things that can't be learned.
Right.
They're obstacles. We need to support that learning, but we can. And the thing that, like, the big take-home message for me, what really breaks my heart about kids with DLD is that by the time they're in fourth grade, they look like typical kids, but they are still struggling. And they may look like typical kids and they're missed. And if we're lucky, they have dyslexia and they test them for dyslexia and then they get caught under dyslexia and then they get some support there. But they have a great deal of potential. They have a great deal of potential. It's not that they can't learn these things. It's that it takes a little bit more effort and and other strategies. And that if we can teach them to support that, they can finish high school. They can get good jobs. They can learn to enjoy language, and they can potentially go to college and be successful, and also be aware of their challenges so that they can make good choices for themselves, in terms of, well, what types of careers do I want to go into? What's going to be a good fit for me? And I have the supports for that. So I think that that's where we really need to put that positive look on, this is what we can do. I'm the SLP, and this is what I can do for you.
And that's our superpower,
we can work together.
Is to give you the strategies for learning language. That's exactly what we're here to do. We're not here to just memorize new words. That a teacher can do that. No, our superpower is giving you the strategies that you are going to then use and generalize. And oh my gosh. Thank you. I love you guys. Oh my gosh. We are going to have to wrap it up. And I don't want to, but we have to. I just want to thank you again for coming back. Thank you for coming back and sharing.
Thank you for inviting us.
Oh my gosh, I love it so much. Really, and it's not, I think, Yeah, I'm still in awe of you guys. I mean, I learned so much over these last two episodes, and I just love it. And to our listeners, if this episode helped you better understand, I hope this did. I love it. I love it. I love it. Thank you everyone for being here. Oh, everyone's saying thank you. You guys are amazing. I want to say thank you for everyone for being here, and I can't wait to see everybody next time on School of Speech. Okay, guys.